Welcome to Podcast Vlogging Tips and Tricks with Alex Merced. On this podcast, we're going to talk about podcast hosting, podcast recording, promoting, and monetization. We'll also interview podcast hosts about what works and what doesn't work in the podcasting world. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/AlexMerced. Also, if you need hosting for your podcast or your website, head over to libertydeal.info to find out about great deals along with special benefits for taking advantage of those deals. Thank you very much. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Podcasting and Vlogging Tips and Tricks. This is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and we've talked about a lot of cool stuff in the previous episodes: how to record a podcast, how to syndicate your podcast on social media, how to host your podcast. Now, this episode, I want to talk more about programming and like the actual content of your podcast and how to get repeat listeners and some tips there. So bottom line is you want to make sure your podcast has a really clear theme. Like, what is the point to listen to your podcast? So like this particular podcast is, if you're into podcasting and vlogging, you're learning about podcasting and vlogging. Or my other podcast, Economics Why Not? Well, if you want to learn about economics, you listen to that podcast. Or my other podcast, Better Today, if you're looking into improving yourself, and becoming a better person and having a happier life, you listen to Better Today. They all focus on one sort of specific idea. I have a couple other podcasts, but I'm not going to go through all of them right now. Just search my name on iTunes if you want. But the bottom line is they all have generally a specific goal in mind of what the content gives. Because you're not going to be able to please everybody with one whole podcast unless you're like a household name. So then you can have a show like a Kathy Lee and a Hoda where you just interview people doing anything. But you could find the niche. So determine what it is that you know a lot about, and it can be specific as you want. Okay, I mean, let's say you enjoy Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but there's probably other Buffy the Vampire Slayer podcasts out there. But maybe you really enjoy Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan fiction. Well, there probably isn't as many podcasts that deal with that. So then you can create that specific a podcast for people who enjoy Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan fiction, where you review different fan fiction from episode to episode. And then one makes it really easy to determine who you need to go reach out to. People who write fan fiction and read fan fiction. Okay, you have a very clear audience who you can interact with, find where they are, and reach out to them, which makes life a lot easier. Okay, and instead of having to scramble everywhere, and hopefully somebody out there kind of is interested in what you're doing. But at the same time, you got to make sure that you give them a reason to listen to the next episode. So one, you want to make sure a very focused episode. Figure out what would they be interested in. Like, again, if we're talking about fan fiction writers, one thing that fan fiction writers want is people to read their fan fiction. So if you actually had someone who reviewed fan fiction and they knew that their fan fiction was read and people can submit it and whatnot, it would actually kind of get a lot of them pretty excited, because then they can feel like their work's being read. Okay? At the same time, you create a community around it. And that's why you should also make sure you always have a Facebook group for your podcast, and then say, if people want to submit questions to the podcast, they submit it to the Facebook group. And on the podcast and in the Facebook group, you should ask a question at the end of every episode. The reason being is that it doesn't, and then basically you always go over the answers or responses that people had to that question in the next episode. The reason being is that it gives people a reason to come back again. Because if it's the first episode they listened to, they may have enjoyed it, but they may not feel like, I need to listen to another episode. But if you have a question or some sort of a hook at the end of the episode that says, I won't know what the conclusion of that is, so the next episode, then they don't have, then basically they have a reason to come back. And then you just keep them hook, line, and sinker. A good example of this is the Political Junkie podcast with Ken Rudin. Fabulous podcast. The dude knows a lot about economics and is a very fun. But what he does the Scuttle Button puzzle every week. And what he does is that he takes different political buttons that he's collected over the years, and he'll put them in a particular order online. And then the idea is that if you take a look at these buttons, it spells out a phrase. And basically your goal is to determine what phrase that those buttons spell out, and then submit the answer. Or he'll ask other political questions like who was the first congressman with a broken leg or something like that, and then people will submit it, and he goes over the answer the following week. But this always makes people want to come in and chime in the next week because I want to know what the answer was. So he has that hook. So things like that. And again, you could also put out those questions, and you also want to interact in that Facebook group. So you want to also do polls, be like, how did you guys like this episode? Hey, I'm thinking of ideas for an episode. What episodes would you guys like to see? You develop that community. You want them vested in your podcast. You want them, you want them to really, really care about being part of what you're doing. Okay, and that's the story there. And then another thing you can do with the group, as far as monetization goes, you can have a separate sort of special group in the sense that you can only get to if you become a paying subscriber. And we'll talk about subscription type approaches later on. But what a lot of podcasts do is if you become like a $5 a month subscriber, you get invited into a special group, and then in that group you kind of get like extra content, basically episodes that are not on the podcast. Or if you're doing interviews, you do like an extra 20 minutes of interview, special benefits. And that's just one way. Later on we'll talk about how you can monetize the podcast, etc. But bottom line, as long as you create content that's focused to a specific audience, and you make sure that there's always a reason for that audience to come back for the next episode, by leaving something a little open-ended, will be good. And on that note, very soon we'll be talking more and more about how you can make money podcasting and monetize your podcast. So make sure you're still listening, so that way you can learn a little bit more about that. Thank you guys. I'll see you guys in the next episode, and thank you very much.